Hello, and thank you for joining us to hear a little bit about our work on bold women of the Eisenhower era. My name is Ann Dowds. I'm a professor in the public policy program, and I run the Women and Leadership program at the Eisenhower Institute. When I joined the faculty a couple of years ago, they asked me if I would be interested in working with the Women in Leadership program. And at first I said, are y'all being ironic? Because I didn't really associate women and leadership with the Eisenhower era. So I thought about it and I decided to take it on as a bit of a challenge and to see what I could learn about women in leadership in relation to the Eisenhower era, and or how I could use that as a platform to educate younger women about leadership. So I had grown up I was born in the late 60s, grew up in the civil rights era in the South, and felt like I had sort of grown up in tandem with the second wave of feminism and had always regarded the 50s as a time of sort of a vacuum of women in leadership and women in power, and certainly in formal understandings of feminism. But as I started to do a little bit of research, I discovered, not surprisingly, that there was a whole lot going on. It turns out that Betty Friedan and the Feminine Mystique didn't just come out of the ether. There was a ton of work going on behind the scenes, and it sort of dispersed areas of what I decided was going to be 5 domains of activism and informal or perhaps not well understood efforts to achieve change, work that was being done by women, but that wasn't necessarily recognized as leadership as was constructed at the time. So much like history has reframed its understanding of President Eisenhower, moving from what everybody thought was sort of this lucky, go along to get along kind of president to someone who exerted incredible power and leadership through charismatic models of leadership, I decided I wanted to think about women of the same era in a new way as well, and to take modern understandings of feminism and modern understandings of critical leadership theory and take those lenses and look back on women and of the time and see what we could learn, maybe using them as case studies, about women of the time and what they were doing to make a difference in their worlds. So using a narrative analysis model, I set about finding some stories of women of that time that embodied what I suspected had been going on. I also ran across Mrs. Ike, a book about Mamie Eisenhower by Susan Eisenhower, and very similar stuff in that book. It was incredible how much Mamie Eisenhower was doing, but the White House Historical Society mostly described her as a proud housewife and disregarded a lot of the work that she was actually doing. So that gave me a sense that maybe I was onto something. And I did a few more case studies that a few of you may have seen if you came to President Uliano's inauguration weekend a couple of years ago. Gosh, maybe it was less than 2 years ago. It feels like a long time with the pandemic and everything. But anyway, I shared 3 stories then. And so I spent that year doing research, gathering stories, coming to understand different approaches to narrative analysis, collecting literature on leadership theory, collecting literature on feminism. And then I started the Women in Leadership program, cohort number 2 for me, in January of 2020. And we were chugging right along. We were doing great work, and we were down in DC, and COVID hit. And of course, everything changed. And when that all happened, so many of my students were just bereft. They were lost. They were kind of floating. And so I felt really helpless in the face of their stress. And so I tried to come up with something I could do that would give us a unified purpose and a distraction from all of the chaos. And I decided I would take what I had intended to be a very long process of research and see if I couldn't sort of crowdsource it with the students. So I offered students, the Women in Leadership students, but then I opened it up to all public policy majors, and then some of their friends, sort of like snowball effect, got involved. I offered them an opportunity to work with me on a book that we're calling, right now, the working title is Feminism, Leadership in the 1950s, Bold Women of the Eisenhower Era. I am sure the publisher is going to shorten that, but that's what we're working with right now to keep the theme going. So I put out the invitation, and 35 students accepted the offer to work with me on developing these case studies. And then that was stage 1, and then analyzing them through lenses of modern conceptions of feminism and leadership. And it's been great. We have a few students who they did it over the summer, and then they needed to set it aside so they could get back to their full-time studies. But most of them are still working on it with me. And I thought, rather than me tell you much more about it right now, it would be fun to have students who are in the midst of it at various stages of their leadership studies share their work with you. And so what you're going to hear is from 5, perhaps 6 students are going to come in and tell you about the research that they did, how they developed their understandings of the women they were studying and the causes they espoused, and then now how they're moving into analyzing those case studies, those biographies, through the literature on leadership and feminism that we've been collecting. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to each of the students, and then I'll give you a few final comments at the end.
Hi, my name is Emily Wilk, and I'm a recent alum of Gettysburg College. I graduated in May 2020, and I'm currently a graduate student at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., preparing to get my master's in public policy in women, gender, and sexuality studies. I first kind of got involved in this book project last May when Professor Dowds approached me about being involved in the book project and kind of started describing what the content of the book would include, kind of this intersection of feminism and leadership in the 1950s, which initially just like drew me right in as a sociology and public policy undergrad with minors in peace and justice studies and women and gender and sexuality studies. This project just definitely aligned with a lot of my prior research experiences and kind of my general academic interests across the board. So I immediately said yes when approached. I think situating this project within the 1950s and kind of paralleling the leadership of President Eisenhower is a very interesting lens through which to approach this project. And as a prior participant in the Women in Leadership program and the Eisenhower Institute, I think we'll definitely just kind of expand upon a lot of the knowledge gained in that experience and kind of create a more like cohesive connection for me as a former Gettysburg College student and kind of moving into a professional field in the public policy and leadership realm. I think the approach of doing a historical analysis through the lens of feminist theory and leadership theory just provides a crucial link to history that is often overlooked in older analyses and kind of is definitely important to incorporate more nuanced and new understandings of feminism and leadership to understand truly just how gender really affects the way in which we view history and we view ourselves. Using this gendered lens, we kind of see how these women were really just very complex individuals and not the monolith that is typically seen regarding women in history, and kind of able to bring them out of the private sphere that history typically boxes them into, and kind of just see what ways they were really making change and kind of subverting those gender norms imposed upon them. So for this project, I'm contributing 2 chapters, and I'd first like to talk about my chapter in the section on civil rights called From Social Gathering to Social Change, how the Daughters of Bilitis and their allies kind of started the lesbian rights movement in the 1950s. So the Daughters of Bilitis was the first lesbian organization in the country, and it started in San Francisco in the mid-1950s. And basically this group was just a collection. It started with 8 women who kind of created a space for lesbian women in the 1950s in San Francisco to just kind of gather and kind of create a social safe space to meet other lesbians, especially during the time of McCarthy era politics, when lesbians and gays were kind of targeted for their identities as part of the Red Scare that was happening throughout the 1950s. But as these women kind of created this space for lesbians to meet and organize, they kind of transitioned into an organization for social change and kind of moved into the activist sphere. So kind of situating them specifically within this project, obviously in my background looking at women, gender, and sexuality studies, they present such an interesting case study to understand feminism and leadership and kind of applying more contemporary theories to their approach to social change. So I think 2 of the more prominent theories in leadership development that kind of can be easily applied to their case is the leadership for social change model, as well as servant leadership, as they look at how their politics and their approach to leadership was very community oriented. So the Daughters of Bilitis they had a 2-fold approach where they created still this community for lesbian women to gather and kind of process their identity in that specific social time, and kind of how to create a way to feel more comfortable being openly lesbian in a society that is very anti-LGBTQ, as well as creating an educational content and kind of component to educate the public and kind of try to challenge those those norms about the lesbian and gay community, that they aren't worthy of the respect that society should give them, that they aren't these second-class citizens that society has deemed them to be. And I think this is kind of that very community-oriented nature of the Daughters of Bilitis' work, that they really just wanted to create a space for lesbian visibility, and kind of separate from the homophile movement that was already developed at that time, that was really trying to organize and advocate for gay rights. They felt that the lesbian cause was also somewhat lost in that organization, and kind of wanted to create their own space to be visible, still building coalitions across these different organizations. So within the homophile movement, within the feminist movement as it developed a little bit later in the 60s, and kind of really creating those coalitions across groups. And again, that servant leadership model of just really being of service to those people in the organization, and trying to create a space where they could grow and develop as individuals. So I think this chapter really brings in a lot of very specific and nuanced leadership theory, as well as like a clear lens into feminist theory, really looking at that intersectional approach of, yes, their identity as women was really important during this time, but also what does it mean to be a lesbian woman during this time, and how that impacted their activism and leadership orientations. My second chapter for this book is situated within the Women in Arts and Society section, and it looks at female athletes during the 1950s and kind of their rise to stardom in a domain that is definitely very masculine and has typically tried to keep women out. And I think in my initial background research for this chapter, I immediately focused on Althea Gibson, who was just an amazing tennis player of her time, the first Black woman to kind of break the race barrier in tennis, and was allowed to then participate in the major tournaments of the time, specifically thinking about the US Open, and how her rise to fame in tennis was a little less traditional than even her white teammates and counterparts, and how that kind of was subverting both gender, racial, and class norms of the time, kind of how she had to face so many different intersectional obstacles in entering the world of sports as a Black woman. And then also how other women athletes kind of adding their vignettes into the chapter just show the expanse of women in sports in that time, and kind of how they were making their mark and kind of opening a space for women to participate in athletics that we can still see the effects of today in the world of sports. And again, I think they really bring this question of visibility and coalition out in terms of their leadership kind of orientation, as well as kind of bringing in that feminist theory of like how they created a space for women where women were typically not allowed. So coalition building, we have kind of organizing across sports, across race, across sexual orientation. We kind of see them all coming together and really working around this idea that they want to find a space for themselves in athletics, and that as women, they deserve a right to play sports just as much as men, and they have the same abilities as men. So again, really subverting those typical gender norms of the time, that women shouldn't be dominant, that they shouldn't be aggressive, that they shouldn't want to participate in such a physical environment. So again, kind of using an intersectional approach, and really rooting this chapter in Black feminist theoretical traditions to kind of show the extra burdens imposed upon some of these women who really had those intersectional identities and kind of found themselves at the margins in society, and how sport kind of gave them a way to work through those obstacles and kind of showcase their abilities as individuals, and not having to conform to the traditional norms imposed upon them by society. And I think just in general, one of the most important parts of this project is that it shows that leadership is complex and messy. There's not one right way to be a leader, and there's not one right way to be a woman leader. And I think retrospectively fitting these feminist and leadership theories to the 1950s kind of shows how leadership is an evolving understanding of how people lead, and these theories really show different conceptions of how women have led throughout history, despite the fact that history has traditionally presented them as this monolith, this static group that serves very specific purposes in society. I think this book is really going to challenge those norms and conceptions, but also kind of shows that even though these women were subversive and transformative during their time, or bold women as the book proposes, that even they have their own challenges to work through in their leadership styles and abilities. and without taking this very specific analytical approach rooted in gender, we would really just have forgotten their contributions to history that would have just remained obscured for who knows how long. So I think this project just really brings out an important part of history that otherwise would have gone unnoticed. And I'm really glad that Professor Dowds has decided to take on this project, and really excited to see how the final book comes out in December 2021.
Hi everyone. My name is Sally Xu, and I'm the lead on the chapter Female Foreign Service Officers Turn Challenges into Opportunities. I am right now a sophomore at Gettysburg College, and I am doing double major in mathematical economics and psychology, also a minor in math. I first heard about this project in my freshman year when I was taking Professor Dowds' first year seminar, Sex and the Supreme Court. I thought it is a really cool opportunity, so I expressed some interest. Fortunately, I got into the project. As an international student, I always have a lot of interest in the foreign affairs. I also know that there were no female ambassadors appointed to several countries. For example, China, Afghanistan, Cuba, Russia, and even Canada. So I thought it would be interesting to look at the reasoning process and history of female foreign service officers. I researched on a couple of female career officers in the 1950s, like Frances Willis, Alison Palmer, and Margaret Douds. I look at their academic background, their career paths, geographic assignment, and their attitudes toward feminism. From there, I try to analyze some common characteristics a woman needs to obtain in order to have a career in the foreign service in the 1950s, and also their leadership roles in the development of feminism. Well, I did get a lot of support and help from faculties, friends, and group mates who also work under the section of Women in Foreign Affairs, sorry. I also had the privilege to meet with Ambassador Taylor and Mrs. Taylor, who gave me a lot of informative and helpful insight about the US Foreign Service. I think it is a wonderful research opportunity, and I did learn a lot from just doing this project. Thank you.
My name is Cora Beyer, and I'm a sophomore now, but I got into this project as a first year, which was a really exciting opportunity for me so early in my Gettysburg career. When the Bold Women Project was initially pitched to me, we had a small collection of stories and influential women, but throughout the year and with the combined input of many talented student writers, it has expanded to include multiple aspects of leadership theory and female history. I'm working on a chapter outlining the history of female marital and financial autonomy, which fits under the civil rights section of the book. As someone interested in public policy and women and gender studies, I was drawn to the ways in which women were able to come together in leadership organizations and integrate themselves into the law and the way policy is formed. Therefore, I analyzed records of the National Association of Women Lawyers, the NAWL, and their monthly journal, and found evidence of several efforts to grant women marital autonomy in the 1940s and 50s. Specifically, Matilda Fenberg and some other lawyers from the NAWL drafted the Uniform No-Fault Divorce Bill, which later inspired a bill passed in the 70s. The NAWL hoped to create uniformity across the United States in regard to divorce rights, which varied wildly from state to state. For example, some states banned divorce altogether, while others had laws so liberal that they were deemed divorce mills. They also hoped to create divorce law that would no longer put women at fault for the end of a marriage and allow them to live a financially independent life afterwards. In conjunction, I'm working with a partner focusing on the history of female financial autonomy throughout the time period. We are combining our research to show the narrative of women struggling with issues in obtaining credit cards, banking loans, car purchasing, divorce, adultery, marital rape, and how group leadership has worked to expand this autonomy. Overall, working on this book has been a very rewarding experience. From learning how to conduct extensive research and analyzing it through a modern leadership theory lens, to working with other students to create a cohesive project. I'm also certainly very excited to be working towards creating a published work. I'm very grateful to Dr. Dowds and the team of student writers for sharing such an important and often hidden aspect of our history.
Hi, my name is Bridget Kennedy, and I'm a senior at Gettysburg College. And for the Bold Women book project, I'm contributing 2 chapters, one to the civil rights section and one to the foreign affairs section. So for the civil rights section, I am researching Amy Jacques Garvey, who was the wife of Marcus Garvey, the founder of the Pan-Africanism movement. And this movement held that African descent people across the world, so in North America, in the Caribbean, in Europe, and in Africa, should come together for Black liberation and fight it as an international struggle rather than several different domestic struggles. So Marcus Garvey was the founder of that ideology, and it really enjoyed a lot of really big success in the 1930s and 40s. However, when he died later in the 1940s, his ideology kind of slid into obscurity. But one of the reasons that is credited today with why Pan-Africanism is still studied in history and why it's still a vibrant ideology is because of his wife, Amy Jacques Garvey. So during Marcus Garvey's lifetime, Amy Jacques Garvey was not on the front lines of leadership. She was very much in the background. However, she still played an instrumental role in growing Pan-Africanism as an ideology. So, for example, she wrote many of Marcus Garvey's speeches, she helped educate him on foreign affairs, and she was very involved in the chapters outside of the US. But after his death, as the ideology was becoming less and less popular, her response, at the end of the 1950s, in 1957, she started writing a book called Garvey and Garveyism, which was an overview of Marcus Garvey's politics and policies, but in a new light. The 1950s was a completely different era than when Pan-Africanism was founded. Anti-colonial sentiment in Africa was at an all-time high, and it was looking like major progress was going to be made. So she reimagined Garveyism for the modern era. But another really important thing that she did was talk about her role in Garveyism and the struggles she had with sexism and recognition within the movement. And the effects of the book were really quite amazing. It led to a resurgence across the world in the ideology, and historians today, looking back at her work, credit her with allowing Garvey's ideas to survive. So for example, Marcus Garvey was awarded Jamaica's highest honor posthumously, just a couple years after her book was published. So I will be writing about Amy Jacques Garvey in the civil rights section of our book, talking about leadership going from the background into the foreground and how she did that with the Pan-Africanism movement. The second chapter I'm contributing to is about intersectionality in foreign affairs, and I will be specifically looking at 2 African-American women, Flemmie Cottrell and Zelma George. And these women were sent by the State Department to Ghana right after Ghana gained independence from Britain, and Ghana was the first African country to gain independence from colonialism in the late 1950s. And they sent these 2 women, Flemmie Cottrell and Zelma George, who were both very accomplished academics in the US, to go to Ghana on a cultural diplomacy mission. So Ms. Cottrell was a renowned nutritionist who had done previous surveys for the State Department in Liberia and in Ghana on nutrition outside of the US. So she actually came to Ghana and talked about how nutritional programs should be built. And Ms. Zelma George, was actually known in the US for being an opera singer, and she broke the color barrier in opera in the 1940s. But she was also a very well-renowned academic for her work on African American spirituals and African American vocal music. So she also went to Ghana to present on that. But the most interesting aspect of the talks that these women did that I'm really going to focus on is how they talked to the people in Ghana about their experience in the US. So they not only lectured on their areas of expertise, but they talked quite frankly about their experience as African Americans in the US and as women. And they specifically talked to a lot of young Ghanaian women about the struggles that were ahead, but how to persevere. So in that chapter, I'll really be looking at how they used their leadership and really tapped into their identity as Black women to help others. Thank you.
Hello all, my name is Daniel Janzo. I'm a senior at Gettysburg College. I study economics and public policy with a minor in philosophy. So I got involved in the project a little bit earlier than others. I was not an original member of the Women in Leadership Eisenhower Institute program, but I had reached out to Professor Dowds and had known from the beginning of when she came up with this idea of co-authoring a book with students that I would really like to be a part of it. So the couple chapters which I will be contributing on have to do in the areas of domestic politics and also in arts and sciences of the 1950s era. So the figure who I did a lot of research and in-depth biographical study on this summer, one of which was Oveta Kolpabi. Kolpabi was the first secretary of the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and obviously served as a traditional, groundbreaking figure of the era and the Eisenhower administration. So she will be contributing to the domestic politics portion of the book, and then another woman who is a little less traditional in terms of leadership in the 1950s because she was in her early 20s is Susan Sontag. I read tons of information and biographical data and journals about Susan Sontag, and I will be compiling that section along with a few other very famous thinkers, Hannah Arendt and some others of the time as well. I really think that most of the students involved in the project also had similar paths to success, such as myself. So we had just months of biographical research and really getting deeply into what each of our people and movements represented in the in-depth, pedantic details. And then we, after our readings of the biographies and doing all the ground and nitty-gritty work, we learned about the evolution of women in leadership and the development of women in the workplace, politics, and the broader world. And so as the project continues, we will be working on implementing that portion in terms of broader world influence, and also we will continue doing what we've done and integrating chapters with commonality. Additionally, this summer, I had the pleasure of working alongside one of my peers, Logan Grubb, to co-found the Gettysburg Journal for Public Policy. The journal will serve as a way for undergraduate students to research and be published through a peer review process at Gettysburg College. What sets us apart from some of the other on-campus journals is our policy focus. So every topic, whether it be anthropology or health sciences or biology, political science, whatever it is, will have some sort of policy implication for the future. And we will publish once a year, every spring, and take submissions throughout the year. I appreciate you all tuning in, and I hope to hear from you in the future. Have a great one.
Thanks so much to all of you students who took time out to make your videos and to share them with us. And I am very excited to continue working with all of you on this. If any of you listening today have any stories that you know of from the 1950s or related to the Eisenhower administration that you would like to share with us that could give additional context to our work, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. It's really easy, adowds@gettysburg.edu. Thank you for joining us today.